welcome to this talk. It's titled Capitalism and Communication, Critical Theory in the Age of the Internet and Communicative / Digital Capitalism. This is a talk that launches a book. It's a book launch talk. It's about my new book, Capitalism and Communication, a Critical Theory, that was published by University of Westminster Press. There's also a German translation available titled Kommunikation und Kapitalismus, eine kritische Theorie, that was published by UTB and UVK. So the two editions, the English one and the German one, are available from these publishers. And in this talk, I want to give an overview of the approach that I'm taking in the book. So let me first introduce the structure of the book. First, there's an introduction. The book is then organized in three parts. The first part outlines some foundations of communicative materialism. The second part discusses communication in capitalist society. The third part discusses how to go beyond capitalist communication and is therefore titled The Materialist Transcendence of Communicative Capitalism. It's organized in the form of 15 chapters. There's an introduction, that's the first chapter. There's a conclusion, that's chapter 15. In between, there are chapters that focus on materialism and society, communication and society. These three chapters make up part 1. Then part 2 about communication and capitalist society has chapters focusing on capitalism and communication, communication technologies, communication society, political communication in the public sphere, ideology, nationalism, communication and ideology, global communication and imperialism. And then the third part consists of 3 chapters. One where communication society is understood as the society of the commons, one on death and love, the metaphysics of communication, and one on communication and struggle for alternatives. And finally, there's a conclusion on how to advance a dialectical, humanist, critical theory of communication and society. In this talk, there will be an introduction, and then I will focus on several dimensions that are also covered in the book: how to theorize society, communication in capitalism and class societies, ideology, and class struggle. So I want to start with an introduction to the approach that I'm taking in the book Communication and Capitalism, a Critical Theory. I'm interested in advancing a Marxist theory of communication. Of course, Jürgen Habermas' theory of communicative action is the most well-known critical theory of communication. His main references in this book are George Herbert Mead, Jean Piaget, and John Searle. Which come from a non-Marxist tradition of thought. Yeah? There is, however, a rich tradition in Marxist theory itself on which we can build a critical theory of society and also a critical theory of communication. So it's possible to dialectically reconstruct certain moments from already existing Marxist approaches in order to ground the foundations of a dialectical and critical theory of communication. And the approach that I'm taking is that I'm interested in the hidden and forgotten elements and works in Marxist theory that matter for the construction of a critical theory of communication. And I'm especially interested in Hegel's Dialectic, in the works of Karl Marx, and in the works of Marxist humanists. So Marxist humanism is an approach within Marxist theory. An outline, an overview of it is given in this collected volume. You can see the cover here of it was edited by Erich Fromm, titled Socialist Humanism. Some of the thinkers from Marxist theory and critical theory that I'm interested in include Adorno, Günther Anders, Ernst Bloch, Angela Davis, Erich Fromm, Lucien Goldman, David Harvey, Eric Hobsbawm, Sheila James, Henri Lefebvre, Georg Lukács, Rosa Luxemburg, Herbert Marcuse, Maria Mies, M.N. Roy, Jean-Paul Sartre, Edward P. Thompson, Claudia von Werdelhof, Raymond Williams, and others. So the approach that I try to renew, that I'm working with, is Marxist humanism. What makes Marxist humanism special? It is Hegelian, which means it's interested in dialectical philosophy and theory. It stresses the dialectics of subject and object, of practices and structures, of labor and capital, the economic and the non-economic, of continuity and discontinuity, and so on. It stresses human beings' practices and is therefore interested in the analysis of social production in society that it considers as a very important phenomenon in society or as the constituting aspects of society. It's interested in praxis, which means the focus on social struggles and class struggles. It's interested in the notion of human essence, which means it stresses that human beings have certain commonalities. So there is a certain universalism. It's not simply interested in what differences human beings have, but what all human beings have in common as human beings. In developing a critical theory, it uses the notion of alienation, both of subjective and of objective alienation. It argues for democratic socialism and socialist democracy, and in doing so, it's anti-fascist, it's anti-Stalinist, and it is also critical of capitalism, which means it argues for collective self-management of the economy and society. It is an open form of Marxism, which means that orthodoxies such as Stalinism that turn socialism into a dogmatic, deterministic, mechanistic, reductionist, and quasi-religious practice are rejected. It believes that there is in the existence of truth in society. Based on Hegel, it assumes that there's a difference between society's essence and the existence of society, between the potentials of society and human beings, and the actuality in class societies where these potentials have not been realized. It's also a form of ideology critique, so it stresses the notion of reified and false consciousness. It's a form of critical ethics, and it's interested in Marx works and in using and reactualizing, further developing Marx works in the 21st century. In doing so, it stresses that there's a certain unity of Marx works, a connection of the philosophical aspects and the political economic aspects in Marx works, which means that it rejects and is highly critical of Louis Althusser's claim that there's an epistemological break in Marx works. There are many reasons why we need a Marxist humanist approach today. One of them is that we are today seeing the emergence of new forms of nationalism and authoritarian capitalism that are dangerous to democracy and can, in the last instance, result in a new world war, in genocide, and so on. And Marxist humanism is an analytical approach that stresses the importance of socialism and humanism as opposition to authoritarian and fascist forces in society. Second part of this talk is focused on theorizing society. And in the book, really my critical theory of society, the critical theory of society that I want to outline, starts with engaging with the notion of meta and the question, what is materialism all about? So I do think that a critical theory of society needs to be a materialist theory. I'm starting with the notion of meta in nature, and with the insight that meta is a causa sui. A causa sui is something that is its own reason and cause. This means that meta produces itself. It is its own cause. Meta is self-producing and self-organizing. For Aristotle, this means, as Ernst Bloch is stressing, that meta is the fermenting substrate of possibility. So meta has to do is always in possibility. It has certain possibilities for development. Matter in nature is quite different from matter in society. I mean, of course, society is part of nature. It's a special part of nature and the natural environment with which the human beings interact through the economy are also part of society. So there's a society nature dialectic. Nonetheless, society is quite a specific part of nature that has very emergent qualities, especially human consciousness, that allows human beings the conscious production and reproduction of society. So matter in society means that human beings engage in the social production and reproduction of society. In materialist philosophy, there's nothing outside of matter exists. So matter is the substance of the world, a dynamic process substance of the world. Yeah. So if people, for example, speak of two substances of the world, matter and mind, or matter and spirit, then this is an indication for taking that they take a non-materialistic philosophical position. Such dualists or idealists also sometimes stress that the mind, information, knowledge, thoughts, and aesthetics are immaterial or non-material, whereas materialist philosophy assumes that everything that exists is material, including information. If something existed really outside of matter, then the world would, in the first and in the last instance, not have a sufficient ground. So if there are two substances, matter and mind or spirit, then the question, what is the fundamental phenomenon in the world, cannot be answered, because then there are two, matter and mind, and the question is, I mean, what is the ground of matter, what is the ground of mind, and what are the commonalities between the two? So the law of ground, the philosophical law of ground, cannot be answered. In this philosophical law, the law of ground says that everything that exists must have a sufficient ground. The human mind, we could say, is a kind of organizational level of matter that organized in that emerged in the development of nature and society, and in the context, so it stands in the context of the emergence of the human being and society. The mind is material, which means that cognition emerges from the brain's dynamic networked activities of production. The brain is also a system of production that produces our thoughts and our emotional and affectual states of mind. The mind and human communication, they do not exist outside of matter. They are aspect of matter's human and societal form of organization. And in this form of organization that we term society, humans create, reproduce, and change society's reality by engaging in reflective, self-conscious, social, and communicative practices. Already Marx stressed the importance of social production in society. He argued, that's a quote, "Just as society itself produces the human being as human, so is society produced by the human being." So there's a dialectic of human beings and society. We can say that society is a complex in which humans consciously produce their life in a social and in a societal manner, which means they produce and reproduce society through social relations in which they engage and in which they encounter each other. In his critique of capitalism's political economy, Marx develops a critique of capitalism that is at the same time a general sociology. So in Capitalism and Society in General, Marx stresses, and that's really his main sociological insight, everything that exists in and through societal relations. Everything in society is a societal relation. So for Marx, the human being is also the essence of its the totality of all of the social relations that human beings engage in. Yeah? So Marx writes in one of the Feuerbach theses that the human being is the ensemble of the social relations that it enters. Social relations, societal relations at the higher macro level of society are very important in society. So phenomena such as the commodity, capital, labor, money, value, classes, exploitation, domination, capitalism, social struggles, and so on, these are all social relations. For Marx writes, for example, in his main work Capital, that capital is not a thing, it's a social relation between persons which is mediated through things. He also writes that value is something purely social and societal. There is, in my opinion, a dialectic of practices and structures in society. So there are human beings. These are the actors, the subjects in society. They engage in individual and social practices within social relations by which they produce and reproduce social structures that are the more enduring features of society that persist across space and time for certain periods. And these structures, social structures, enable and constrain, which means they condition the existence of individuals and of individual and collective social actors. So the structures condition the practices of human beings, and they enable further practices. So there's a recursive, dynamic, dialectical relationship of social structures and social actors in society. Marx speaks of the species being as the human essence. He argues that the human being is a species being, which means that it is a natural, sensual, social, societal, producing being. Ludwig Feuerbach stressed that language and communication are part of the human species essence. Feuerbach writes, language is nothing other than the realization of the species. The I is mediated with the you, in order, by eliminating the individual separateness, to manifest the unity of the species. So when Marx argues that everything is a social relation, then a relationship between the I and the you, between the one human being and the other human being is established. And Feuerbach stresses that these social relations, these material aspects of society, are linguistic and communicative relations. And of course, Marx then added that work is a fundamental social aspect of society and of human beings' existence. So there's also dialectic of work and communication. Constructivists frequently challenge the claim that there is a kind of universalism of humanity and of society, and that there is a kind of human essence. But what human essence really means are these features that are common to all human beings in society. And humanism as a philosophy is based on this universal assumption that there is a kind of commonality of human beings, and this commonality, these common aspects of all human beings is what in critical philosophy is termed human essence. However, the constructivists, radical constructivists, tend to claim that there is no essence of human being at all. The social philosopher Martha Nussbaum warns in this respect that constructivism can easily result in what she terms in an extreme relativism that justifies inequalities, oppression and exploitation in the name of anti-universalism, anti-essentialism and difference. In the theoretical approach that I take, there are three realms of society: the economy, politics, and culture. The economy is the realm of the produce use values. Politics is the realm for the production of collective decisions that are binding for all human beings in society or in certain social systems. And culture is the production of meanings, where we make sense of society, of other human beings, and of social phenomena, and also of nature. These realms, they are neither separate nor fully reducible to one system. Also, they are not all equally foundational for society. So certain forms of reductionism assume that one realm is dominant. So, for example, cultural reductionism assumes that culture is the dominant system. So I don't think we can reduce society to one of these realms. However, I also don't think that they are all equally important, or they are also not independent from each other. There's a dialectic of the different realms of society. And this, in Marxist theory, this is the problem of how the economy and society are related to each other, or it has also become known as the base and superstructure problem. And Raymond Williams, in his book Marxism and Literature, has given an answer to how we should deal with this relationship of economy and society, and also the relationship of economy and culture. This book, Marxism and Literature, was first published in 1977. In it, Williams points out the foundations of cultural theory and how to think about culture. So I think it should better be called Marxism and culture. Of course, this is relevant for literary theory, but literature is not the main focus of the book. In Marxist, and Williams stresses that in Marxist theory, certain categories have been used for analyzing and describing the relationship between the so-called base and the so-called superstructure. Categories such as determination, mediation, typification, representation, illustration, homology, or correspondence. He says that all of these categories are insufficient in order to explain the relationship between the economic and the non-economic in society. He says that all of these approaches are not materialist enough. In orthodox Marxism, there is the assumption that there is an economic base and a political and ideological or cultural superstructure. So one imagines society as an edifice where there is an economic base that consists of the means of production and the relations of production. This approach has, for example, been taken by the French structuralist theorist Louis Althusser, who influenced many thinkers, lots of approaches. He influenced structuralist thought and also post-structuralist thought. And he says that this space superstructure model has the great theoretical advantage of the Marxist topography. It is of the spatial metaphor of the edifice, of the base and the superstructure. He says there is the advantage that this model simultaneously it reveals that questions of determination or of index of effectivity are crucial. The model reveals that it is the base, the economy, which in the last instance determines the whole edifice. So there is a base superstructure model in Althusser. However, this model is static, mechanical, and also reductionist, which is something that E.P. Thompson, in his book The Poverty of Theory, pointed out. So E.P. Thompson was a British historian, a Marxist historian. He was a Marxist humanist theorist and engaged in this book, The Poverty of Philosophy, with Althusser's theory, and provided a Marxist humanist alternative. And he characterizes Althusser's approach with such images, as you can see here, images of mechanic machines. And here Thompson argues that in Althusser, society is described as a machine. What is missing are human practices. What is missing is human experiences. He stresses that in Althusser, practice is not the source of a level of chance and freedom in society. For Althusser, society as a machine stands for pure necessity. Marxist humanism, in contrast, stresses the dialectic of chance and necessity in society. E.P. Thompson was a great writer, also a great polemicist. This book, Poverty of Theory, and many other of his works are also very polemical works, and it's a good example of polemical writing in social theory. So, conceptualizing society as a house is not feasible. Yeah? However, we can take the metaphor of a staircase, of a step model. The information philosopher Wolfgang Hofkirchner has developed a step model of information, where information is organized in different stages of information, communication, and cooperation, where each stage is dependent on the underlying stage. However, at the same time, the new stage has also emergent qualities, so that it cannot be reduced to an underlying level. Yeah. If we think of society in terms of a stage model, then we could say the economic is a certain level, and the non-economic is another level that is built on the economic, but also has emergent qualities. If we think of staircase or the stage model, then this is a non-reductionist form of theorizing society. In the stage model, each level has a certain autonomy vis-a-vis the underlying steps and levels. In the house, in contrast, everything depends on the quality of the foundation. So I don't think that the edifice or the house is a proper model or metaphor for society. I'm much more like the river is a metaphor and as a model for society, because it allows us to imagine society as a flow. The river is dynamic and productive. We can say that the economy is the main current in the river. The river dynamically flows. There are also other currents, such as politics and culture, that flow in and out of the economy. They mix with the economy. There's dynamic engagement of different spheres of society. They flow into each other. Production is not something static, it's also reproduction. It's dynamic. Production is a flow, a process where new qualities emerge that remake and undo other qualities, that reshape certain realms of society, and so on. In philosophy, this relates to the to process philosophy, and dialectical philosophy is always a process philosophy. So Heraclitus was an early classical philosopher. He was a dialectical and dynamic philosopher. So, for example, Plato reports that Socrates said about Heraclitus in a dialogue that Heraclitus says somewhere that everything gives way and nothing stands fast. Everything is likening the things that are to the flowing of a river. So already Heraclitus used this metaphor of the river as a flow for characterizing the world. Georg Lukács, in his Ontology of Social Being, characterizes everyday life as a large river. He speaks of the river of everyday life. Lukács' metaphor of the river is a metaphor for society's dialectic. Everyday life has a dynamic character. There are networks, processes, and streams of human production. The river branches out and has the creative capacity to create new branches, which allows us to metaphorically stress the productive and contradictory essence of dialectical processes and of human activities in society. You might know this Waltz by Johann Strauss, the blue Danube, where the river is blue, it's clean, so it is a metaphor for beauty. You can see also here a beautiful image of the blue Danube. However, we know that in contemporary societies, many rivers are polluted, so they more look like the picture of this river. So when I use the notion of the river, of the flow as a metaphor, I don't want to idealize society. It entails also the idea or the concept of the polluted river, which I think is a metaphor for capitalism. And it's a metaphor of how capitalism endangers humans' everyday life. And of course, there's also environmental pollution in contemporary capitalism and so on. Space and time are also important in society. In this context, I have been influenced by Henri Lefebvre's theory of the production of space, and also David Harvey's theory. David Harvey is a Marxist humanist, a geographer, an economic and social theorist who has been influenced by Lefebvre's concepts of space and everyday life. So what is space all about? We can say that space is the next to one another of matter. In society, it means it's the next to one another of human beings. And space always exists as space-time. So space exists in time, and time exists in space. Time is the after one another of matter. In Henri Lefebvre's idea, the production of space, the key idea is that human beings not just produce social relations and certain use values, but in doing so, they also produce social space. Space is neither a container nor a thing. Social space is a means of production and a social product. It's process and product of society at the same time. This means that there's a dialectic of social space and human practices. Social spaces bring together social institutions, social practices, social relations, social structures, and social systems within a bounded realm. This is a model of social space. There is a kind of dialectic of human beings, social relations that they enter, and social space that they construct, produce, and reproduce through these social relations. So social examples of social relations are social structures. Social structures constitute social systems. Social systems constitute organizations and social institutions, and social space is a bounded collection of a variety of a large amount of social relations, and they're human beings, which means it's a bounded collection of social structures, social systems, and social institutions. And human spaces are produced by human beings. Human beings produce social relations, and the collection of social relations that is bounded by some boundary is a social space, which means human beings produce via the production of social relations and the reproduction of social spaces also social spaces, and they reproduce social spaces, and social spaces then enable and constrain, which means they condition human beings' existence, human practices, and their social relations. I want to focus on questions of a critical theory of communication. Of course, the most well-known critical theory of communication is Jürgen Habermas' approach, especially the one he sets out in his 2-volume book, The Theory of Communicative Action. And this book is based on a dualistic ontology. So dualism means to separate things. Yeah, Habermas separates system from life world, work from interaction, economy from culture, and instrumental from communicative action. So action is quite an important category for him. He says that there are two forms of social action: communicative action on the one hand, and strategic action on the other hand. Strategic action for him is associated with the system or the systems of the economy, that's the market and capitalism, and the state system and bureaucracy. Whereas communicative action for him has to do with life world and with an action oriented toward reaching understanding and with consensual action. So it is a communicative action for Habermas is emancipatory, whereas strategic action has a dominative character. So clearly communicative action is a form of liberation and emancipation for Habermas. However, I don't think we can separate communication and work. So I take a different approach, where there's a dialectic of communication and work, and of culture and the economy. The purpose of communication is understanding, which means it is also purposeful action. So communication does not stand outside of purposeful action. Really, all action has a purpose. All action wants to achieve certain goal. In class societies such as capitalism, communication is not communicative reason is not separate from instrumental reason. Communication is part of the organization of instrumentality. So, for example, capitalists and managers communicate capitalist ideology to their employees, politicians and public, in order to justify class society and class relations. Also, advertising is a specific form of communication that has an instrumental character. It wants to instrumentalize consumers into buying certain products. Managers communicate always in most cases in an instrumental reason when they manner when they communicate instructions to workers. In the 20th century, we saw the rise of the culture industry, where communication and culture take on the commodity form. So these are some examples where communication takes on an instrumental character. We can generalize this insight and say that in post-40s neoliberal capitalism, we saw have seen the subsumption of communication under instrumental reason, plus the diffusion of informatization of communication. Of computer technology, and this has been done to such a degree so that communication and labor and communication technologies have become central factors in the capitalist antagonism between productive forces and the relations of production. So we can speak of the emergence of a communicative or digital capitalism. There's also the term strategic communication, that blends strategic action and communicative action. And what it means is that corporations communicate strategically in order to yield more profit via advertising, public relations, and other strategies. In the book, I set out a dialectical alternative, where communication is a form of what Georg Lukács in his book Die Ontologie des gesellschaftlichen Seins, the ontology of societal being, calls teleological positing. In this model, work is the model of human activity. But what is work all about? In work, human beings stand in a relationship to other human beings in the so-called relations of production, and in these relations of productions they utilize means of production. These are certain objects, namely the object of works, and the tools, the instruments of works, and humans use these means of production in order to produce a product of work that results from the work process. So there is a dialectic of subject and object in the work process that results in a subject-object, which is the product of work. This idea of teleological action was introduced by Lukács in his very last book, the Ontologie of Societal Being, zur Ontologie des gesellschaftlichen Seins. It's a completely unknown book that is really forgotten, has thus far also not been fully translated into English. Only excerpts were published in the form of 3 volumes, but here Lukács sets out really a full critical theory of society and He relates to Aristotle and Marx with this concept of teleological positing. So Aristotle wrote that everyone who makes for an end. This means that all production, all action has a certain goal. The same idea can be found in Marx. So there's an Aristotelian telos in Marx's theory of work. Marx argues that the human being also realizes his own purpose in work. For Lukács, so building on Aristotle and Marx, society is a complex of complexes where humans posit the world teleological. Teleological positing means, or in German the term is teleologische Setzung. It means that humans try to achieve particular consciously set goals in the work process, and for doing so they employ certain means for doing so. So there's a means-end relationship. The teleological positing for Lukács means, on the one hand, that's a quote, the intervention into concrete causal relations in order to bring about the realization of the goal, the positing of a goal and its means. On the other hand, it means that there is, again a quote, a conscious creator, end quote, in the work process. And then in setting out his idea of causes, Aristotle identified 4 causes. The material cause, that's the causa materialis, the efficient or moving cause, the causa efficiens, the formal cause, that's the causa formalis, and the final cause, that's the causa finalis. What is this all about? The material cause is the question, what from, out of which does something emerge? The efficient cause is the question, where from does something emerge? The formal cause is the question, what is the matter here? And the final cause is, why does something take place, for the sake of which does it take place, for what, for whom does it take place? And this idea can be related both to the process of work and the process of communication. So in the work process, the resources and materials out of which something is produced are the material cause. The workers are the efficient and moving cause. The work process, where workers apply the means of productions in order to produce new goods, this is the formal cause. And the goal, the final cause, is the satisfaction of certain human needs. Communication, based on Lukács' idea of teleological positing and the Aristotelian causes, is a particularly form of production and a form of work, where the material cause is culture as totality of ideas and meanings. So we produce new ideas based on existing ideas. The causa efficiens, the efficient moving cause, are the human subjects. What are they doing? That's the formal cause. They are communicating in the communication process. Why are they doing that? That's the final cause. They are doing that in order to produce and reproduce social relations and society. So there's a dialectic of production and communication. Communication is a specific form of production that is oriented on understanding and socialization, and production, on the other hand, is only social and societal through the communication process. There's a work communication dialectic. There's the work of communication and the communication in work. Work has a communicative character and communication has a work character. And Aristotle characterized, among other things, the human being, he said one of the features of the human being is that it's a son, logon, echon. Widely translated, used translation of this passage is that the human being is a rational animal. However, Hannah Arendt and Charles Taylor in their works question this traditional translation of the son, logon, echon as a rational animal because the logos that is in this word of the son, logon, echon is the Greek word for both utterance and speech on the one hand and for reason and rationality on the other hand. So there's a double meaning of logos that applies to the essence of the human being. The human being is a teleological being and a communicating being, which means that social production is the human telos and communication is the production process of social relations. So a human being is speaking and communicating and rationally producing. It can only produce socially via communication, and communication is itself a rational production goal process that is goal-oriented. So this idea of the human telos, of the teleological being, as Lukács points out, includes both the idea of communication and of work. In Lukács, this is only very implicit, whereas I'm trying to make these assumptions very explicit, and I'm trying to explicate that in society that there is a work of communication, dialectic. This also means that communication is material, and also information is material. That's something that Raymond Williams stresses in his approach that he terms cultural materialism. So Williams writes that communication and its material means are intrinsic to all distinctively human forms of labor and social organization. However, I would add that also the opposite is true. Work is also intrinsic to communication. So communication, it's not just the case that communication is intrinsic to work. Work is intrinsic to communication too, because production as the teleological positing of goals forms the model for all human practices in society. So production takes on a specific form in communication, namely the production and reproduction of sociality. There's a model that expresses this circumstance. There are human beings in society and in social systems. It's visualized here as actor A and actor B. They communicate, and by communicating they produce and reproduce sociality, social systems, social structures, and society out of a specific communication process. Social relations emerge that are reproduced. These social relations enable and constrain and condition new social relations in which humans are active and practice. There are human practices, social practices that are organized through communication. Thereby new sociality is produced, and so on. So there's a dialectic here where humans through communication produce sociality. This form of sociality enables further practices that are communicatively mediated, through which new sociality emerges, and so on. Also, the human being, is a communicating individual. It's also a cognizing individual. It cognizes, it recognizes nature and society. Cognition then is also the foundation of communication. So in the communication process, we externalize certain knowledge of the world, certain knowledge products. We communicate certain parts of our knowledge to other human beings. These human beings, communication is a reciprocal, recursive social process where human beings interact symbolically with each other. So one communication started by one individual produces some cognitive results, new cognitive patterns in another person's brain. One person recognizes what the other person is saying, and vice versa. Also, the second person communicates back, which changes the cognitive patterns and knowledge products of the other individual. There are individual and social types of knowledge. So knowledge takes place at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the group and at the level of organizations. And this dialectic of individual and social knowledge can be found at the level of the economy, politics, and culture, where we find individual and social forms of knowledge. This means that there is a social dimension to human practices. There is an information dimension, and then there's also a spatial dimension. I don't go into further detail here. An important notion that mediates activities in society has been introduced by Erich Fromm. It's the notion of the social character. This is a notion that Fromm uses for explaining how individuals and society stand in a relationship. So it's a mediating category. The social character is a mediation between culture and the economy, and between the individual and society. Fromm defines the social character as the matrix of the character structure common to a group. So the social character is a psychological totality. It brings together a social group's common psychological features. What Fromm terms the social character is a particular form of group whose members share particular psychological features. The social character is not limited to one social system. It operates across and in multiple social systems at once. The social character is a mediation level in between the individual psyche and society. It is formed by communication in multiple social systems. So through communicating, through engaging in social relations in various social systems, human beings really form their character structure. This is not purely individual, so social groups tend to have not exactly the same behavior and thought patterns, but there are certain commonalities. That they share in behavior, thought patterns, and so on. So the social character is a character structure specific to a particular group in society. Communication forms and reproduces the social character. There is a model here that shows two parts of society, the economy and culture. You see certain individuals, both in the economic system and in the cultural system. They produce in these systems through social relations. They stand in relation to each other. So these are the lines between the individuals. The C here means communication. By communication, they form these social relations, and in the economy, they produce certain economic products. In culture, they produce collective meanings. And what is decisive here is that the social character not just operates in one of these social systems. There are human beings are active in several social systems at once, and the social character is a feature of individuals across different social spheres, across different social systems, that is constituted by communication in social relationships within a multitude of different social systems. Next, I want to talk a bit about the notion of communication technology, or what we can also term the means of communication, and how I make sense of. So means of communication are structures that mediate the communication process. These are means that humans use in the communication process, and for each means of communication, there is an aspect of production, distribution, and consumption of information. And I distinguish between 5 types of communication technologies. In primary communication technologies, there is the use of the human body and the human mind. No technology is used for the production, distribution, and consumption of information. An example is, for example, a theater performance, where the audience is co-present with the actors. In secondary communication technologies, there's the use of technology for the production information, but not for distribution and consumption. Examples are newspapers or magazines. In third level, tertiary communication technologies, there's the use of media technology for the production and consumption of information, but not for distribution. Examples are storage technologies such as CDs, DVDs, tapes, records, or hard disks. In fourth level, quaternary communication technologies, there is the use of media technology for the production, distribution, and consumption of information. Example is TV or radio. Then there are the quinary communication technologies. These are digital media technologies such as the internet, social media, the mobile phone, where production, distribution, and consumption converges within one communication technology, the computer and computer networks, digital technology. So digital media enable the consumption, the consumers of information also become producers of information, and there's the possibility for the creation of user-generated content. And in this image here, these 5 types of communication technologies are visualized in relation to the production, distribution, and consumption technology. So, for example, if you have a look at this aspect here, these are secondary communication technologies such as traditional newspapers and magazines. There is this human subject here that produces information. It encodes certain meanings through media production technologies into media content. This media content is then printed in the form of a magazine, a newspaper. It's distributed without media technologies, and also then you read the newspaper or the magazine where you decode it also without media technology. And that's what I term secondary or second level means of communication. What is also interesting is the level 5 communication technology, the quinary communication technologies, because these are digital media technologies. Here the processes of production, distribution, and consumption converge within one technology. They are not separate technologies for production, distribution, and consumption, but the computer is a kind of universal medium, and it's not just a medium, but also production technologies that enables the production of information, the distribution of information, and the consumption of information with the help of one technology. And the whole online media industry is built on such technologies, and it builds an economic organization around these technologies. When this industry is organized in a capitalist manner, then it's the capitalist digital media industry. The question is also, how are technology and society related? One approach, an ideological approach, that can again and again be found in theoretical debates, in empirical social research, but also in everyday conversations and in popular media and in the news media. This popular approach to conceiving of the relationship between communication technology and society, and between technology and society, is technological determinism. In technological determinism, one assumes a one-dimensional relationship between communication technology and society, a one-dimensional cause-effect relationship. There is the assumption in technological determinism that communication technology brings about certain effects and changes of society. If these changes that are said to be caused by technology are said to be positive, then this technological determinism takes on a version that we call techno-optimism. And if it's connotated that social change in a negative way, then we call it techno-pessimism. So a typical form of technological determinism are sentences such as, the internet results in more wealth, more democracy, more human intelligence, and so on. This is the form of technological optimism. Whereas a form of technological pessimism are, for example, sentences like, the internet makes us more stupid, the internet causes unemployment, the internet causes fascism, and so on. The problem here is that the internet and communication technologies, these are machines, so these are technologies, these are things. We cannot abstract from social differentiation or the changes of society from social practices and from social interests and from social relations, from class relations, from relations of power and domination, and so on. So technological determinism is too abstract. It abstracts from capitalism, it abstracts from power relations. Raymond Williams, in this context, argues that in technological determinism, the new technologies are invented, as it were, so that's the claim, in an independent sphere. And it said that they create new societies or new human conditions. Williams stresses that the development of use of technologies is shaped, in contrast to the assumptions of technological determinists, by social, political, and economic intentions. And he stresses that such intentions set limits and exert pressures, but neither wholly control nor wholly predict the outcome of complex activity. There's another version of conceiving the relationship of society and communication technology that is a kind of reverse determinism and reductionism. Yeah? It's also one-dimensional, but here one assumes that causes that technologies have are and the effects of technology are built into communication technology by society. This perspective is also called the social construction theory of technology. So it assumes that there is no level of autonomy, no level of unpredictability of communication technology and of technology in general, but the effects can be read off the social shaping the social structures into which technology is embedded. However, many modern technologies are very complex dynamic systems, which means, of course, they are shaped by social structures, by social interests. There are certain intentions that certain groups bring to the production, the development of technologies, and then these technologies are used. But we cannot always assume that the effects of technology can be fully predicted. Yeah? So there are certain dynamics, both of technology, because it's a complex system, and also in society that is a complex system too, that we cannot predict. So both social construction and technology and technological determinism are short-sighted. They are one-dimensional approaches, whereas a critical theory of communication is based on a dialectic of technology and society. It assumes that communication technologies are part of larger social structures and are part of society, and as such have multiple potentials and effects on society. And it assumes, on the other hand, that society has multiple ways of how it shapes communication technology. Part 4 of this talk is focused on communication in capitalism and class societies. I want to start with the notion of alienation in an article published in the journal CCC, Communication, Capitalism and Critique, that I edit. David Harvey focuses on the notion of universal alienation. So for Harvey, alienation is a universal process that he terms universal alienation, which means that for him, alienation on the one hand has to do with the alienation of labor in class relations, where workers do not control the means of productions and the products that they create and the conditions of work. However, for him, alienation also extends beyond production into the realms of the realization of value, the distribution of commodities, consumption, politics, everyday life, culture, social conditions, and so on. In general, we can say that alienation is an asymmetric power relation where humans are not in control of the objects and processes, conditions and practices that shape their everyday life. I discern between three types of alienation: economic alienation, political alienation, and cultural alienation. So economic alienation has to do with work in class relations. So the workers don't control the means of production. They don't control the products that they create. These products are private properties, and they are, by what Marx terms the dull compulsion of the market, coerced into having to sell their labor power as a commodity, so that they create commodities for capital. The second form of alienation is political alienation. This political alienation means that citizens are not in control of the political system. They are excluded from political decision making. In the most extreme form, political alienation means dictatorship. And cultural alienation means that there's a lack of control by humans of culture. There's a lack of voice, respect, and recognition. So cultural alienation means the spread of ideologies that disrespect human beings, that make their voices insignificant, but that want to reassure them at the same time that domination is okay and is natural, and that society could not be different. So you could say that these three forms of alienation, if you summarize it, exploitation in class relations is economic alienation, dictatorship is political alienation, and ideology is cultural alienation. Erich Fromm has related alienation to what he terms the social character, and he says that there are authoritarian types of society and humanistic types of society. So we could say that humanism is a non-alienated form of society, or humanist social systems are non-alienated forms of social systems that stand in antagonism to alienated societies. And so there are ideal type social subjects that we face. On the side of alienation, we have the exploiter in the economy, the dictator in politics, and the ideologue and demagogue in culture. On the other side, we have in non-alienated social system, we have the humanist, we have the commoner in the economy, we have the democrat in politics, and we have the friend who treats others with respect and solidarity in culture. We can say that the basic feature of alienation is that humans are not in control of the structures and practices that shape their lives. And in a class society, humans don't control the means of production and the objects that they produce and the objects that they use in production. In a dictatorship, humans are not in control of political decision making, and in an ideological culture, humans do not control worldviews and the definition of reality. From alienation in economic relations means that there's destruction, exploitation, and competition. In social relations in general, alienation means that there's aggression and hate. Humanism, on the other hand, means that there is the possibility of work and creation for everyone. So it means that hard labor and toil due to the effects of automation and technology and the high levels of productivity, toil has come to an end, so that human work has been transformed into what Marx terms in the German ideology the well-rounded individual that is active without compulsion in a variety of activities that are creative activities. In social relations in general, humanism or the end of alienation means that there are loving and social relations of love and cooperation where there's solidarity and humans help each other. We can now apply these aspects also to the realm of information, communication, and culture. So there are alienated and non-alienated forms of information and communication, and this relates to the economic realm, the political realm, and the cultural realm. Economic alienation in respect to communication means that knowledge and communication are commodities. There's the exploitation of knowledge labor, and means of communication are private property. the alienation of political communication means that there is a dictatorial control of knowledge and communication processes. So the individuals who create knowledge are not included in determining the conditions under which communication and knowledge work takes place. Then there's cultural alienation in respect to information communication and culture, which means that there's ideological knowledge and communication. Humanism challenges alienation. So humanism in relation to economic communication means that knowledge and communication are a commons. There's the co-ownership and co-production of knowledge production in a self-managed manner. So there are cooperatives, self-managed companies that don't make a profit. They are non-profits. They are collectively owned, and they create knowledge products and culture. So cooperative, self-managed companies are a way of democratically managing the knowledge and cultural economy in a participatory manner. In respect to political communication, humanism means that there's participatory knowledge and democratic communication. In respect to the cultural system, humanism means that there's socialist humanism, knowledge and communication. So humanism in the realm of culture challenges the ideology that humans are by nature unequal and that domination and inequality must exist. It challenges the division of society and is based on the insight that there's one universal humanity. So humanism stresses that human beings are equal beings and that they have something in common that is the foundation for treating everyone with respect and in an equal manner. So visualizing these insights, we can say that social production, what Lukács calls teleological positing, is the foundation of society. And in principle, there is a distinction between instrumental reason and action on the one hand, and between cooperative reason that creates commons on the other hand. So in heteronomous societies, we find in the economy an antagonism between exploitation and the quest for self-management. In politics, an antagonism between dictatorship and the quest for democracy. And in culture, an antagonism between ideology and moral recognition on the one hand, and the quest for friendship, recognition, and solidarity on the other hand. These antagonisms also translate into the realm of communication. In the economy, as an antagonism between knowledge and communication as private property, and the exploitation of communication labor on the one side, and the quest for communication commons that challenges the commodification of knowledge, culture, and communication on the other hand. The political realm, there is, in respect to communication, an antagonism between dictatorial governance of communication and communications. Communication is a process. Communications in the plural means means of and systems of communication. And this dictatorial governance of communication and communications is challenged by the quest for democratic communication and democratic communications. In the realm of culture, we find on the one hand ideological knowledge and communication, and on the other hand communication among friends that is non-ideological and advances humanism and recognition. So in class societies, the social and communication are antagonistic. The question is also what metaphors should we use in order to make sense of communication. And in the literature, different metaphors are suggested. I have listed some examples here: the channel, the city, the computer, the container, communication as control, as dance, as dialogue, as environment, as exchange, expression, game, communication as gate, communication as the individual, as information, as machine, as market, as motorway, as nature, as network, as persuasion, as plant, as rhizome, as ritual, as stage, communication as the street, as symbolic interaction, as technology, as theater, as transmission, as village, as war, and as wave. I think none of these metaphors really adequately grasp the dialectical character of communication in class societies and in capitalism. Such metaphors are a bit unhistorical, because they seem to describe communication independent of the concrete social relations that exist in a certain historical social formation, such as capitalism. So I think we need different metaphors. On the one hand, we need a metaphor for capitalist communication, and when thinking what metaphor to use, I was reminded of Kraftwerk's song Die Roboter, the robots, where the robots are dancing. So I think capitalist communication could be described by the metaphor of the dance of remotely controlled robots. In capitalism, we have communication that is governed by what Horkheimer terms instrumental reason, or what Herbert Marcuse terms technological rationality. These two notions of instrumental reason and technological rationality go back to Lukács' notion of reification, who in turn bases this notion on Marx's notion of fetishism. So there's instrumental reason in the form of ideology, domination, and exploitation, these three forms of alienation: economic alienation, political alienation, and cultural alienation. In class societies, in dominative societies, there are groups that try to control other human beings, that try to make them act in ways that benefits just a small group and class of human beings, so that only some have advantages and others have disadvantages. So a small elite group and class of people tries to control society and tries to instrumentalize other people's labor power, their opinions, and their worldviews and consciousness. They try to treat and reduce human beings like things. They try to turn them into robots that do not think and act actively and consciously and creatively, but simply accept the dominant interests that the capitalist class tries to impose on them. So the robot is a metaphor for communication in capitalism. Whereas humanist and socialist communication has a different way of treating human beings and a different way of communicating. So here I would like to introduce the metaphor of communication as a dialectical dance in a socialist and humanist society. This metaphor expresses that there is a mutual connection of human beings, that they cooperate, treat each other as friends, and they deal with communication, information, and culture as a common good. And society in general is organized as a realm of the commons and a realm of solidarity, so that there is welfare for all, there is wealth for all, there is political participation of all, and there is respect of all and visibility for all in culture. So this is the idea of the dialectical dance as a metaphor for socialism, for humanism, and for socialist and humanist communication. This is also related, in my opinion, to the African philosophy of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is a way of treating human beings. It's a humanist way of treating human beings. The African philosopher Mogobe Ramose argues that Ubuntu is the basis of African philosophy and of African humanness. Desmond Tutu, the South African theologian, argues about Ubuntu that a person is a person through other persons. Ubuntu is this insight that you treat others in a humane way. You treat them as human beings. Ubuntu is not based on the logic I think, therefore I am. It says rather I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. A person with Ubuntu knows that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed or treated as if they were less than who they are. So Ubuntu is about treating humans as human beings in a solidary manner, and I think that's also the essence of socialism. Socialism is a humanism, and humanism is only true humanism if it is socialism. Quite comparable to Ubuntu, Erich Fromm makes this distinction between having and being. So in a class society, it's all about having and controlling things as properties and as commodity, whereas socialism is about being. It's about leading a good life for everyone. It's not about things and controls. It's not about having. It's about the end of the struggle of existence. It's about the end of necessity. It's about the creation of a plenitude of wealth, happiness, participation, and visibility and recognition of and for all. However, contemporary society is a class society. A class is a social and power relation where the exploited class is forced to produce with means that it does not own. It produces goods that it does not own. So, Marx, in this respect, speaks of the capitalist economy and argues that the labor market is a silent compulsion of economic relations. He argues that the worker in a class society works under the control of a capitalist to whom his labor belongs. So that's in a capitalist class society. And in capitalism, the product is the property of the capitalist and not that of the worker, who is the immediate producer. So if we go to a model of the labor process, then alienation takes on economic alienation takes on three dimensions. There's the alienation of labor power, that's in respect to the human subject, the worker. That's the silent compulsion of economic relation that tells us that humans in class societies and in capitalism are forced to work for others. In capitalism, they are forced to sell their labor power as a commodity. Then there's alienation from the means of production. Humans don't control the means of production, which are the objects of labor and the instruments of labor, such as the technologies. And finally, they are also alienated from the product of labor. The immediate producers, the workers, do not control the products that they produce. These products are controlled by the dominant class. There is also an international division of communication work and of digital labor in digital capitalism or in digital class societies. These three dimensions of the work process, the subject, the object, and the products, are alienated, and these forms of alienation take place in a global division of labor, where large transnational corporations outsource labor to different parts of the world, of the earth, in order to minimize investment cost and maximize their profits. So first there's extractive labor, where miners produce minerals. They extract them from the earth, from nature. These minerals are enter the next production process, where process labor, industrial labor, produces hardware components. These components then enter the next production process, where assemblers assemble components into media technologies, and these hardware technologies are then used by information workers in information and service labor in order to create various information content, design, images, digital media content, culture, entertainment, and so on. And all of this takes place in an international division of communication labor. In respect to digital labor and digital technologies, we can talk of an international division of digital labor. So there are the conflict mineral workers who are often enslaved in poor countries. There are the assemblers, such as the workers at Foxconn at China, who work under highly exploitative tailorist working conditions. There are the Google Play workers, highly paid and highly stressed software engineers and other cultural and digital workers who have very high wages, but they are also poor because they don't have a social life. They work so much overtime that there's hardly time for life outside of the workplace. For them, life is labor, and their friendships, their lives are organized in the Googleplex and in the digital companies. There's no life or hardly life outside of labor. Then there is software work that is outsourced to developing countries, such as India, where wages are paid that are just a fraction of the wages that software engineers earn in the West. Then there's the unpaid user labor, the unpaid digital labor of, for example, Facebook and Google users. Based on Dallas Smythe, we can say that they are an audience labor that creates attention for advertisements, and it does not feel like labor, but they are also exploited by digital advertising companies such as Google and Facebook. And then there is a whole economy based on internet platforms. There are platform workers that are often low paid or partly also unpaid. There's crowdsourced online labor. These are, for example, platforms such as Elance or Freelancer or Upwork, where freelancers tend to try to find work online, but it's a global labor market where the average hourly wage is very low. So different forms of exploitation in the international division of labor, such as slave labor, ongoing primitive accumulation, and absolute surplus value production in tailorist factories. There's a new labor aristocracy, like the Google Play workers. There's a new imperialism of software engineering, where software production and other digital labor is outsourced to developing countries. There's audience and user labor, the commodification of audiences and of users data. Then there's the peace wage and the new precariat in the platform economy. So different Marxian categories can be used in order to explain the international division of digital labor. In capitalism, we find capital accumulation as the principle of the economy. So the capitalist economy is all about accumulating capital, money capital, by exploiting labor. But capitalism is not just an economy, it's also a society, where the principle of accumulation is the general model for production in society. So capitalist society is a generalized sphere of accumulation. Capitalism is on the one hand an economic system, but it's also a political and cultural system. It is a system that is based on the logic of accumulation, on the accumulation of power. which means the accumulation of capital in the economic sphere, the accumulation of collective decision power by political groups in the political system, and the accumulation of meaning-making power in the cultural and definition power in the cultural system, for example, by celebrities, and so on. The capitalist economy is growing through the exploitation of labor. The capitalist does not own the body of the worker, as is the case of slaves, who are the private property, but there's a labor market who forces workers to sell their labor power to capital. There's this idea of the social worker by Tony Negri and other autonomist Marxists who stress that there's also unpaid, unremunerated, and low-paid work in the in capitalist society. There are also the unemployed. So the working class is larger than the group of wage workers. It also includes house workers, modern slaves, audiences of advertising funded media, Facebook users, the unemployed, the precariat, and so on. We can say that the logic of accumulation has been transferred from the modern economy into modern politics and modern culture. Generally, accumulation, the logic of accumulation, combines the logic of quantification to create more and more and more commodities, to accumulate more money, more power, more visibility, more likes on Facebook, and so on. And all of this is based and combined with the logic of instrumentalization, with the logic of instrumental reason, the instrumentalization of labor, the instrumentalization of citizens, the instrumentalization of consciousness in ideology. This is how Marx describes the capital accumulation process. That's what a capitalist company does. It invests money M in order to buy the commodities labor L and means of production MP that are used by the workers in the production process in order to create a new commodity C prime that contains a surplus product delta C. So a new product is created by the workers, which is then sold on the market, so that M prime, a new sum of money, is invested that in the ideal case is larger than the invested capital. That's the process of capital accumulation. More capital is the end result of the production process. Parts of this capital are reinvested so that there's more production of commodities, and capitalism is a system of growth. And this process where M is turned into M prime, a larger sum of capital accumulation, takes place at the level of the individual company, at the level of an industry, at the level of an economic sector, at the level of an economy, at the local, regional, national, transnational, and global level. So at the level of world capitalism, the world system, we have one collective global worker and one collective global capital that accumulates on the one hand, capital that is accumulated on the one hand by the exploitation of the global worker, the global working class on the other hand. And this global working class exists in an international division of labor. If we look at media capital in the communication industry, then there are different types of capital. There are such accumulation processes. In principle, there's capital accumulation based on media content, which also includes the advertising industry. Advertising is a special type of content. And then there's media technology that is sold as a commodity. These realms of the culture and media industry are related to finance capital. They're also related to commodity production outside of the media industry, and they are related to human subjects as workers, as audiences, as consumers, and so on. So that's a model of the capitalist culture and communication industry that I outline in more detail in the book. I'm particularly interested in advertising, because advertising is a strange commodity, and in 20th century capitalism, advertising and consumer culture has become very important. That's also indicated by, for example, work such as Horkheimer's and Adorno's work on the culture industry. This notion of the culture industry indicates the commodification and the industrialization of culture. And in advertising, there is a special type of capital accumulation. So if you think of Facebook and Google, these are advertising companies. They sell targeted advertisements. We don't pay for the access to Facebook and Google for using them. So the platforms themselves are not a commodity. The platforms are produced by software engineers employed by Google and Facebook in the capital accumulation process. Today's paid labor that produces a product P1 in this capital accumulation process, but this is not a commodity. It's a free gift, as Stella Smythe, the Canadian political economist of communication, says so. And then the commodity is P2. It's a different commodity that is sold. It's the unpaid audience and user labor that creates attention for advertisements, and that creates data that is used for targeting advertisements. So what Google and Facebook sell is advertising space that is targeted via the mass surveillance of all of our online activities on these platforms, so that that targeted ads are presented to us. When we click on such a targeted ad, then value is realized, and the data commodity and audience commodity is sold by Google and Facebook to an advertising client, and they realize profit and make money out of our online activities. Stella Smythe stresses that the audience attention is the commodity that advertising financed media companies sell to advertisers in order to yield profit. He builds the idea of the audience commodity and of audience labor based on this. This idea can also be applied to digital media corporations that use targeted advertising. The advertising in these cases is different than in traditional advertising. Traditional advertising that can be found in commercial television, radio, and commercial print media. Here, the advertising is targeted. The users are active in respect to also producing not just attention and not just interpreting content. They also produce user-generated content. There are algorithmic auctions. There is mass surveillance of all of our online activities. There are predictive algorithms that predict if you behave in a certain way, you might online, you might like certain commodities that are then presented to you in a targeted manner. Targeted online advertising, digital advertising is targeted and individualized. These are some features of the digital audience commodity. Audience labor turns into digital labor, and the audience commodity turns into a digital and data commodity. Here we have some data on digital advertising. In generally, digital advertising has been hugely growing in the past 20 years. In 2020, digital ad revenue makes up more than 50% of the worldwide advertising revenue. There's a prediction that in 2023 it will account for 60% of all advertising revenue. The major global digital advertising sellers are Google, Facebook, Alibaba, Amazon, Baidu, Tencent, Microsoft, Verizon, Twitter, and Sina. In respect to digital advertising, on average, we can say that Google and Facebook control about 2/3 of the global digital ad revenue. So they are quite powerful there and have a duopoly in digital advertising. But given that digital ad spending is growing, Google and Facebook today almost control 30% of the global advertising revenue. So that's not just digital advertising, but that's global ad revenue in respect to all revenues. So Google and Facebook are powerful advertising companies. They are indeed the world's largest advertising corporations. This is data on how global advertising revenue has developed since the early 1980s. You can see that in the early 1980s, newspaper advertising accounted for almost 50% of all advertising revenue in the world. Nowadays, in 2020, it is down to about 5% of advertising revenue. You can see that that since 2000 there has been a steady and almost exponential growth of the share of advertising and internet advertising, digital advertising in the combined total world advertising revenue. So in 2020, this is already above 50%. So there are changes in the media industry, in the advertising industry, a development towards digital advertising. Print media are suffering. Television advertising has been relatively stable at a high level, not as high as internet advertising, but this means that newspapers and magazines that have traditionally been funded to a significant extent by advertising revenue are struggling in digital capitalism. They are struggling for survival, and they try to develop new business models such as paywalls and so on. Of course, at the same time, print media are also about news. It might be a different model if they would turn into non-profit organizations that actively reject advertising and organize themselves as cooperatives and as audience-owned organizations that are also funded on the one hand by audiences and on the other hand by press and media subsidies that could be derived from taxing the digital giants and large transnational corporations. I was interested in in what the largest sectors of the global communications industry are. I found data for 2018 on the global revenues of certain sectors of the information and communication and cultural and digital industry. And you can see that there are three industries that have that in 2018 had a global revenue of larger than 600 billion US dollars. That's the software industry, the telecommunications industry, and tech consultings and systems integration. Also above 500 billion US dollars in annual revenue is the broadband industry, the advertising industry, and tech outsourcing and hardware maintenance. So also an industry such as advertising is among the largest sectors, and we can see software, telecommunications, advertising. These are very powerful sectors in the global communication industry. What types of models of capital accumulation are there in the capitalist communication and digital industry? In the book Communication and Capitalism, a Critical Theory, I identify a number of capital accumulation models in the culture and digital industry. First, there's the media content model, where content is sold as a commodity. Think, for example, of Microsoft that sells software licenses, or think of Walt Disney that sells access to entertainment as a commodity. And then there is the media services model. For example, there are call centers or certain business services. Media and digital services are sold here. For example, there are certain public relations service agencies such as WPP. Then there's the advertising model that where advertising, attention, and personal data is sold. Think, for example, of Facebook or Google. Then there's the hardware model where technologies for the production, distribution, and consumption and use of information are sold as commodities. Think, for example, of HP or Apple that sell hardware, and also other corporations. There's then the network model where the access to communications networks is sold as a commodity. Think, for example, of AT&T or Comcast, Verizon, Deutsche Telekom, China Mobile, Telefonica. These are all companies that sell access to communications networks. There's the online retail model. Think, for example, of Amazon or Alibaba. They sell all sorts of physical and non-physical commodities via online stores. So these are large e-commerce platforms. Then there are subscription and streaming models where the access to libraries of digital content is sold as a commodity. Think, for example, of Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Prime, or Disney Plus, or also Apple TV. Then there's the cloud storage model where online storage space and web space is sold as a commodity. Examples are web hosting platforms such as GoDaddy or Amazon Web Services, or cloud storage platforms such as Dropbox, Apple iCloud, Amazon Drive, and others. Then there's the capitalist sharing economy and capitalist platform model where there is a rent that is yielded for the conduct of a service whose sale is mediated via an online platform. Examples are Upwork, Uber, Airbnb, Deliveroo, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and so on. And then there are mixed models where various of these models and of these different types of cultural and digital commodities are combined. There's the sale of different communication commodities. So there's a complex capital accumulation model that does not rely on selling just one type of commodities, but different types of commodities. So think, for example, of Amazon. That's a good example. Amazon sells different types of commodities. There is its online shop, where it sells commodities in online retail, but Amazon also sells hardware such as the Amazon Kindle, Fire, and Echo. It also owns media such as the Washington Post, so it also sells content, advertising, and subscriptions to news media. There's Amazon Web Services where it sells the services such as web and cloud hosting. There is Amazon streaming services such as Amazon Prime or Amazon Music Unlimited. There's Amazon advertising where it sells advertising and so on. So a range of different commodities. So you can see that there is a variety of capital accumulation in the capitalist communication industry. Another question that arises is, and it's covered in one chapter in the book, is in what type of society do we live? Do we live in a capitalist society or in an information society? There are different types of information society theories. This is a kind of typology. There are theories that more focus on knowledge, so that's the subjective dimension of information. Then there are those that more focus on information technology. These are more objective theories. And then there are theories that stress that there is radical change going on, that a new society claim, which is also an ideological, they make an ideological claim that a new society has emerged that they call the knowledge society, the post-industrial society, or Castell speaks of the network society, some speak of an internet society, and so on. So they argue that there's radical change, radical novelty. The other or the opposite claim is that nothing has changed, that we still live in a capitalist or class society, that where there are continuities. There are some observers who claim capitalism has not changed since the 19th century. My approach is that I speak of the emergence of a communicative and digital capitalism that combines the subjective and the objective dimension of information. So there's knowledge labor on the one hand, and there are new digital network and communication networks on the other hand, and there's neither radical change nor continuity. There's continuity and discontinuity at the same time. Digital and communicative capitalism signifies a certain change of the way capitalism is organizing itself. It is a new dynamic and sphere of capital accumulation. So capitalism can only sustain itself and reproduce itself by changing itself. So there's a dialectic of continuity and change. Capitalism is a dynamic system. Adorno in 1968 said that the basic question of sociology is if we live in an industrial society or in a capitalist society. We can reformulate Adorno's question by asking, do we today live in capitalism or in a digital society? And Adorno's answer was that in 1960s, society was an industrial society according to the forces of production, and the capitalist society in the context of the relations of production. We could say that today capitalism is of course still around in relation to the relations of production, and then there is a digital mode of production or an information mode of production in relation to the forces of production. The question, however, is when we speak of the emergence of informational forces of production, of digital forces of production, and then the question is the digital industry, the capitalist digital industry. How large are they in terms of the global capitalist economy? So digital capitalism is just one dimension of capitalism. And what I did for the financial year 2018 is that I went to the Forbes list of the world's 2,000 largest transnational corporations, and I downloaded the full data and organized this data according to industries and in respect to the number of companies in certain industries, their share of sales, of profits, and assets. So let's have a look at an example here. What is interesting is, for example, the share of certain capitalist industries in the global profits of the world's 2,000 largest companies. And we can see that the FIRE industries, that's finance capital, that's capital in finance, insurance, and real estate, accounts for 33.7, or accounted for 33.7 percent of the profits of the world's largest 2,000 companies in 2018. The culture and digital industries accounted for 17.7% of the global profits of these 2,000 largest transnational corporations in 2018. Energy and utilities accounted for around 10%, manufacturing and construction for 13.1%, and the mobility and transport industry, which also includes the car industry, for 9.4%. So these are all significant shares, which means that capitalism is multidimensional. There is digital capitalism, finance capitalism, hyper-industrial capitalism, mobility capitalism, and so on. So also capitalism is not just one capitalism, it's also dynamic and complex in the sense that there are many different capitalisms, different capitalist industries that are, there's a dialectic of these industries. So they are not separate, they have their distinct capital accumulation models, but they all are also dialectically interpenetrating and interacting with each other. So let's say, for example, digital capitalism is linked to other capitalist industries. It's linked to finance capitalism via venture capital investments into digital startups, and there's the listing of digital corporations on stock markets. Digital and cultural capitalism are linked to hyper-industrial capitalism, where energy is produced, and where traditional resources such as hardware is produced. So running digital capitalism requires massive amounts of energy inputs. So digital capitalism is linked to classical resources produced in industrial capitalism. So there are estimations that running the internet requires around 10% of the global energy production, and of course most of the energy production is non-renewable energy plus nuclear energy, which is dangerous, and also non-renewable energies of course advance climate change and environmental problem. Digital and communication industries are also interlinked with the transport and mobility industries, because global communication advances the increased transportation of people and goods. So there is an interlinkage and an interpenetration of the digital and culture industry on the one hand, and the mobility and transport industry on the other hand. So there is a variety of capitalisms that together make up one universal global capitalism that is based on the production of commodities, the accumulation of capital, and most importantly, the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of the global worker by global capital, the exploitation of a global working class in an international division of labor by global capital. The global working class, so there is a global working class. How large is this global working class? Yeah? If you think of the working class as what Marx called a collective worker, a combined worker that is globally organized, then how large is the working class? I found data for 2019 that I compared to data for 1991. In 2019, there were 105 million employers in the world, so capitalists, which is a fairly small number, in comparison to the amount of workers we find in the world. There were around 200 million unemployed, around 190 million unemployed. I think they are part of the working class. They are what Marx called an industrial reserve army of workers. Then there were different types of workers: wage workers, own account workers, contributing family workers. If we sum up employment plus unemployment, then this makes up 3.5 billion workers in the world. I had a look at how these workers are organized along different industrial or economic sectors. 25.5% of them are in agriculture, so that's not the end of agriculture. In 2019, 25.5% of the working class work as agricultural workers. However, there's a shift. In 1991, the agricultural workers made up 43.3% of the global working class. Manufacturing since the early 1990s and today has been relatively stable. In 1991, manufacturing workers accounted for 23.1% of the global working class. Today they account for 22.2%. So there's no end of industry. Industry remains relatively stable as an important factor of in global labor. And then there's service employment, including information labor, that in 1991 accounted for 33.6% of global workers, and today accounts for over 50% of global workers. So clearly there are sectoral shifts, and overall there's a huge there are sectoral shifts within the global working class, but there's agricultural, manufacturing, and service and informational labor within the global working class. We can assume that retired people are to the same, on average, to the same degree capitalist and workers, and that the poor are also part of the working class, which allows us to model the figure for the global working class, which means that the total global working class in 2019 is 5.7 billion workers. That's 74% of the global world population, that in 2019 was 7.7 billion human beings. Capitalists just accounted for around 1.4% of the global world population, which is around 1%. There are also around 2 billion children. I don't include children in in these figures, because children, they are neither workers nor capitalists. It's relatively open what their class status will be in the world. Of course, we have to include child labor, child workers in the figures. But with around 3/4 of the world population making up the global working class, we can say that the working class is the largest human subgroup of humanity. It's the largest group in society. It is a universal group of human beings. It's exploited by capital. It's around 6 billion people. The working class is the largest subgroup of humanity, and it has a class interest. I mean, an objective class interest, which is the sublation of class. So the working class stands for the universal interest that there should be a classless society where exploitation and class come to an end. I already mentioned that capitalism is organized at the global level due to phenomena such as the rise of protectionism, economic crisis, new forms of nationalism. There's a certain deglobalization also going on, and also the coronavirus crisis has deglobalized economies, has resulted in closed borders and so on. Nonetheless, transnational corporations continue to be very powerful, and they constitute an economic form of globalization, where we are seeing the spatio-temporal enlargement of economic structures and practices of production, distribution, and consumption. There is, however, also political globalization and cultural globalization, where we see the spatio-temporal enlargement of power and decision-making, and of political practices, the globalization of politics. And we also see the globalization of lifestyles, of cultural practices, and of friendships, and so on. Economic, political, and cultural globalization is not caused by the internet and by communication technologies, but communication technologies are the result and outcome on the one hand, plus the medium of the globalization of capitalist society. Do we live in a network society or in a global society? No, because, I mean, Castells speaks of the network society, but why Castells became so well known with his trilogy on the network society is that the network society is really an uncritical concept. Everyone can relate to it. Yeah, companies and capitalists, managers can relate to it because they think, oh, we are networking our companies, but also activists and protest movements can relate to it because they see themselves as a networked multitude of protesters. Yeah, so this is not a critical concept; it's a neutral concept, a concept that everyone that has something for everyone. Yeah, whereas a concept such as global capitalism or the new imperialism stresses that neoliberal capitalism has been based on the commodification of everything, or what David Harvey calls the accumulation by dispossession at the international and global level of capitalism. And capital as an economic entity drives beyond national boundaries and organizes itself on a transnational scale in order to find cheap labor, cheap means of production, commodity markets, and global and transnational investment opportunities. So that brings the fourth part to an end. So part 5 of this talk is focused on the communication of ideology. And I'm basing my notion of ideology on Georg Lukács and his book History and Class Consciousness, where Lukács introduced the notions of reification and reified consciousness. And he bases his analysis on Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism. Marx stressed that in capitalism, the economy in society is dominated by things, by commodities, and by money. So it appears to consumers and workers like the economy consists of things, of commodities and money. And this thing-like character of the economy veils the class relations underlying the commodity and capital. So commodity is produced by workers, but when you consume, when you buy a commodity, such as a computer, you cannot see the social relations. You just see the thing. You buy an iPad, an iPhone, you just see the thing, the technology. You don't see the underlying working conditions, the class relations. You don't see the labor of the Foxconn workers and how they are exploited and so on. And Lukács uses this notion of fetishism in order to introduce a critique of capitalism and a critique of ideology in capitalism. He writes, Lukács, that history becomes fossilized in a formalism incapable of comprehending that the real nature of socio-historical institutions is that they consist of relations between men, between humans. So what commodity fetishism does is that it presents society, or it makes society appear that in an unhistorical manner. It robs society and humanity of its historical dynamic character. We don't see the social activities, the activities of production, labor, everyday life practices and social struggles that underlie the commodity form and that underlie the things that we are confronted with in consumer capitalism. The Italian autonomist Marxist theorist Mario Tronti argues that ideology is always bourgeois. Which implies that Marx thought and that critical theory is not an ideology. It's not the ideology of the worker, but it's a critical theory. Of course, there are also other notions of ideology, where any worldview is conceived of as an ideology. Terry Eagleton, in his book Ideology, identifies 6 concepts of ideology. The notion that I am using is the critical notion of ideology and the approach of ideology critique, not the notion of, not the approach of an ideology theory, where ideology is any worldview of any group in society, or of particular groups in society. The approach that I take, that is based on Marx and Lukács, distinguishes between true and false consciousness, practices, interests and needs. Based on such an understanding, ideology is something that justifies the power of one group or an individual. It justifies how groups or individuals exploit or dominate others. So it's about legitimation, and Max Horkheimer says that the functions of ideology are justification and concealment. It tries to justify exploitation or domination, and it tries to conceal the true nature of society by making claims that do not correspond to reality, or by distorting reality, by presenting false information, such as what is nowadays called fake news and so on. So ideology is a reified and mystified semiotic representation of the world. It tries to misrepresent or distort reality, and ideology manifests itself in a variety of forms, in artifacts, belief systems, concepts, ideas, symbols, images, videos, animations, institutions, meanings, phrases, language, practices, representations, sentences, systems, texts, thoughts, words, and so on. In capitalism, there are 2 features of ideology. On the one hand, there is an ideological structure of commodity fetishism. So commodity fetishism is itself ideological, which means that the producers and consumers can in capitalism not experience the class relations that they are part of, and they cannot experience commodity production in its totality, of the international division of labor, for example. commodities and money as things hide class relations. So commodity fetishism means that capitalism's economic structures are ideological. But then ideology itself is also fetishist, so there's a fetishistic structure of ideology, which means that ideologies, just like commodity fetishism, naturalize. They have the character of naturalizing domination and exploitation. Lukács writes in this context that the veil drawn over the nature of bourgeois society is indispensable to the bourgeoisie itself. The ideology needs to be communicated in order to be effective in society. So ideology is not different from the economy. It's different and from the economy, but economic at the same time. So ideology, in its effects, is a cultural phenomenon because it communicates meanings, although false meanings. But the economy is also working in ideology and in culture in the form of cultural and ideological labor. So there are those who produce and reproduce ideologies, the ideologues who try to construct and disseminate ideologies. So Marx already wrote that there are ideological workers who are the thinkers of the ruling class. It's active, conceptive ideologists. So today there are on the one hand think tanks, for example, in the intellectual sphere that create political ideologies, but there are also public relations, advertising agencies, and so on, that create consumer culture, an ideology that tries to make people consume commodities and ever more commodities and specific commodities. So advertising is also a form of ideology, it's product propaganda. We can then distinguish between, on the one hand, ideological workers who produce ideologies, and on the other hand, critical knowledge workers who produce critical and emancipatory knowledge. And this can be seen in different kinds of realms of society. So, for example, in relation to belief system, ethics, and philosophy, there are in the critical realm public intellectuals who create progressive insights about society, and on the other hand, demagogues who try to manipulate the public and spread ideologies. So ideology is always communicated. However, it's not. It's an attempt to spread false consciousness and to make the individuals and the population follow these and believe in these false ideologies. So it also has to do with belief systems. However, it does not mean that everyone is manipulated by ideology and that ideology is always successful. Ideology is first and foremost always the production and distribution of ideological content. The question is how the recipients of ideology react to it and what knowledge they have of an ideology. So action and knowledge of in the context of ideology play an important role. Yeah? There are different combinations that I visualize in this matrix. Marx said that ideology works based on the principle they do this following ideology without being aware of it. Slavoj Žižek argues that nowadays ideology works differently. He says they know very well what they are doing, but still they are doing it. However, I think these are just two possibilities. I think in terms of knowledge, one can be conscious of an ideology that one is confronted with. One can, or not conscious. You can be partly conscious of it, or you can be critically conscious of it. In terms of action, you could follow an ideology, you could follow parts of an ideology, you can not follow an ideology and just ignore it, or you can resist an ideology. And so there are then 16 possibilities of action and knowledge in the context of how humans act in respect to an ideology. So, for example, if they are not conscious of an ideology but follow it, then this means they do not know it, the ideology, but they do it, they follow it. on the other side of this spectrum, if someone is critically conscious of an ideology and resists it, then it's the principle they oppose it and they resist it. They are aware of the ideology, they oppose it, they are critical of it, and they actively resist and struggle against ideology. So there's no necessary correspondence between the production of ideology, the ideological content that is encoded into the ideology and is then disseminated, and how human beings react to it. But of course, there are, powerful classes and groups in society invest money and resources, such as ideological workers, and the purchase of advertisements, online advertisements, and so on, in order to spread ideology such as fake news and so on. So they try to make the likelihood that people follow ideology. They try to increase this likelihood by a political economy of ideology, by investing money into ideological workers and resources such as advertisement. I think in contemporary societies we really unfortunately see the rise of nationalism. Why this is so dangerous is because history shows us that the rise of nationalism has again and again resulted in genocide and in war. So really the danger of the rise of new nationalisms is that there will be a new world war. Nationalism in general is about the claim that there are differences of culture, language, or race in society. The Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote about books about ideology, and he wrote about the history of nationalism also, as part of the history of capitalism, and he writes about nationalism. The basis of nationalism of all kinds was always the same: the readiness of people to identify themselves emotionally with their nation and to be politically mobilized as Czechs, Germans, Italians, or whatever, a readiness which could be politically exploited. Already Marx wrote about nationalism, so I picked out this passage here, where he wrote about nationalism among English workers who hated the Irish migrant workers. He writes about it the following way: the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who forces down the standard of life. Today, we can find similar claims, that the ideologues, right-wing demagogues, want to make us believe that migrant workers take away the jobs of workers who have lived in the country since their birth, and that they are responsible for bringing down the standard of life. Whereas in reality it's neoliberalism and class relations that result in exploitation, in the downgrading of public services and of social standards and so on. Marx continues to write: in relation to the Irish worker, he, the English worker, feels himself to be a member of the ruling nation, and therefore makes himself a tool of his aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He harbors religious, social and national prejudices against him. So lots of nationalist prejudices are spread against migrants, refugees, people from other cultures, and so on. Marx continues to say, this antagonism is kept artificially alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. We can observe the same today. Lots of tabloid newspapers or right-wing claims on social media, racist fake news can be found that make false claims about migrants, refugees, about different cultures and so on. They try to construct scapegoats. Marx continues, this antagonism is the secret of the English working class impotence, despite its organization. It is the secret of the maintenance of power by the capitalist class, and the latter is fully aware of this. So Marx already in the 19th century described how nationalism works. Also, Rosa Luxemburg was a critical analyst of nationalism. She was showing that there was a link between the rise of nationalism in the early 20th century and the late 19th century and imperialism and the and warfare. So she argues that the combination of nationalism and imperialism resulted in the First World War. She analyzed nationalism as what she terms a misty veil that conceals in every case a definite historical content. So what Rosa Luxemburg points out is that nationalism is an ideology that is a form of political fetishism that fetishizes the nation as a cultural entity that is pure and so on, and distracts attention from the fact that culture has a historical character, that culture is hybrid, that culture is the outcome of historical, political, and economic developments. Luxemburg, based on Marx and Engels, then writes that the workers have no fatherland, they need no nation. The workers' fatherland is the socialist international. So what nationalism does is that it constructs the nation as a fictive ethnic community, as a mythic collective, in order to divert attention from class structures and the real causes, the power inequalities that are the causes of social problems. Etienne Balibar, a French Marxist philosopher, argues that racism and nationalism are dialectically intertwined. He writes, racism is constantly emerging out of nationalism, and nationalism emerges out of racism. There are then different types of nationalist discourses: biological nationalism, economic nationalism, political nationalism, and cultural nationalism. Biological nationalism relates to the claim that there is a different races, that there are superior and inferior races. Economic nationalism claims that there's the superiority of and pride in aspects of the national economic system. It talks of our economy is the greatest economy in the world, and so on, and says that other economies are inferior. There's political nationalism that relates to the political system and power structures. It proclaims the superiority of and pride in aspects of the national political system and the inferiority of other political systems. So it, for example, speaks of our great political tradition, the political battles and wars we have fought, the glory of the political nation and the state, and so on. And then there's cultural nationalism that refers to and relates to society's cultural system. It proclaims the pride and superiority of a certain national culture, of traditions, habits, language, literature, and so on. And at the same time, it claims that other cultures are inferior. So nationalism always makes the claim in any of these respects of biology, economy, politics, and culture that there is a nation that is unitary and that is superior in respect to other cultures, groups, and so on, that are seen as a danger, that are scapegoated, and that are presented as being inferior. I have analyzed how nationalism and ideology is communicated on the internet in a series of books, such as, for example, the book Digital Demagogue, Authoritarian Capitalism in the Age of Trump and Twitter, or the book Nationalism 2.0, or recently the book Nationalism on the Internet, Critical Theory and Ideology in the Age of Social Media and Fake News. These are empirical analysis of how nationalism, authoritarianism, and ideology is communicated on social media. They are grounded in critical theory. In the Communication Capitalism book, I, on a more abstract theoretical level, engage with the notions of ideology and nationalism, racism, and so on, from a theoretical point of view, from the point of view of a critical theory of society. And there, I use the term right-wing authoritarianism, which is a kind of ideological disposition that can also shape individuals, groups, institutions, and society. So it's not just an ideology, but these are also principles of how social systems can be structured in a right-wing way. And there are four distinct elements of right-wing authoritarianism. It's the belief in in the practice of authoritarian leadership, where there is a strong leader and who dominates over the people. So the belief in a Führer, and that a Führer and the leader is needed in society. Nationalism is the construction of fictive ethnicity, the nation as a we, that is presented as being superior to the outside world. Along with this comes the use of the friend enemy scheme as an ideology. So the nationalist we is presented as being opposed to an outside, a they. It's a contradiction that is constructed. I mean, it is artificial, but it's claimed that there's an superior nation, we, us, and then there are they, them, who are the enemy, who are presented as a danger to the nation, and so on. So that's the friend enemy scheme. And then there's patriarchy and militarism and the combination of it, which means the institutionalization of sexism on the one hand, but on the other hand it means that the way political and social problems are being dealt with is in a militaristic manner. So violence is seen as a solution to social problems and for solving conflicts, and it's also seen as a way of how the identified enemies should be treated. I mean, in the mildest form, this takes on the version of law and order politics. In more extreme forms, it takes on the form of militarism, where the soldier is glorified and identified, constructed as the ideal type citizen. The male soldier always comes along with a kind of gender division of labor in society, where there are also certain stereotypical roles that are assigned to women, such as the mother, the houseworker, and so on. And militarism, I mean, in the last instance, suggests that conflict should be solved by war, and also by extermination of the enemies. And that's also how right-wing authoritarianism can, when it's intensified, can also result in a fascist society, where it's characteristic that the way the identified enemies are treated is that they are killed. So all and also political opposition is eliminated. So this then means that militarism, as one dimension of right-wing authoritarianism, turns into fascist terror. And I want to give an example of how economic nationalism, how nationalism works. It's Donald Trump's use of Twitter. So in the book Digital Demagogue, Authoritarian Capitalism in the Age of Trump and Twitter, I analyzed how Donald Trump is using social media. You can, for example, here see some example tweets here from his 2016 presidential election campaign. You can look at the colors. It's all in the red, white, and blue of the US flag. The way he is dressed is also in the red, white, and blue. For example, he tweeted here, "My administration will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American." And I will show you also a related video. So this was a video that Trump posted on the occasion of the US Labor Day. Let's have a look at it.
The American worker built the foundation for the country we love and have today. But the American worker is getting crushed. Bad trade deals like NAFTA and TPP, such high and inexcusable taxes and fees on small businesses that employ so many good people. This Labor Day, let's honor our American workers, the men and women who proudly keep America working. They are the absolute best anywhere in the world. There's nobody like them. I'm ready to make America work again and to make America great again. That's what we're going to do on November 8th.
So what Trump does in this video is that he constructs a mythic collective of US Americans, the US nation that consists both of capital and labor. So he argues that capital and labor have a joint interest, a unified national interest of capital, labor, and he says he will make America work again by helping small, medium-sized and large US businesses. However, by helping businesses, for example, by giving them tax breaks, not making them pay taxes, doesn't mean that you're helping labor automatically. So Trump presents capital, labor as the same, and he distracts attention from the class conflict. He speaks about idealizes the US nation in order to distract attention from the class conflict. And when he speaks about the enemies of the US nation, he typically speaks about foreign nations, such as Mexico, China, and so on. And he says that Mexico and China, there are foreign workers who come into the US from other countries, and he scapegoats immigrants. He scapegoats the Chinese-Mexican industry and says they are dumping the prices on the world market and so on. However, of course, free market neoliberal capitalism was not an invention of Mexico and China. It was quite influenced by American ideologues and politicians like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, ideologues like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and others. And of course, US capital is transnational capital, and it exploits workers in the US and in Mexico, in China, and other countries. So what we can see here is how economic nationalism operates in order to construct a unitary nation where capital and labor have the same interest. However, it distracts attention from the class conflict. Nationalism, racism, they also take on make other claims, like three of them that you can often find on social media and in other public discourses are the following ones. The claim that large numbers of migrants and refugees are flooding our country, that our welfare system cannot cope with migrants and refugees, that they are too many, that their culture is foreign and alien to our national culture. So these are quite frequent nationalist claims. It's an ideological rhetoric that assumes that the nation is under threat. So a friend-enemy scheme is constructed, and that the migrants and refugees are a threat. It's claimed to the welfare system, although when you look at statistics, then in many countries you can see that migrants pay much more into the social system and the tax system than they get out of it. So these are ideological claims that scapegoat refugees and migrants in order to distract attention of how capital is at the heart of social problems, and it overlooks class relations. It normally does not talk about class relations. Also, the claim that immigrants and foreigners are alien to our culture and national culture assumes that there's a unitary culture, but normally in any country that you live in, if you look at the people living on one end in the far north and the far south, or the far east and far west of it, their culture is quite different because nations are not unitary units. They are the result of political developments, often of warfares that develop in different manners. So nation states are never pure. Their culture is never pure. They're always, as Stuart Hall stresses, hybrid. Franz Neumann was a critical theorist. He wrote a great book about the analysis of German Nazi fascism. The book is called Behemoth, and he writes in this book that racism and anti-Semitism are substitutes for the class struggle. So Neumann points out this ideological role of nationalism and of racism and anti-Semitism. Balibar and Wallerstein, in their book on race, class, and nation, argue that racism is constantly emerging out of nationalism, and nationalism emerges out of racism. We can also, sometimes this claim is made that there is so much cultural change because so many migrants are coming into a country. There's an ideological claim that there's a Muslim threat and so on. Yeah? Although Muslims in Western countries make up a small share of the population. So the question is, what kind of cultural change is really taking place, and immigration of course results in a more hybrid culture, but it's not actually a migrant culture is not the main cultural change that has been going on in Western societies in the past 50 years. Yeah, so I looked at some statistic in terms of worldviews and religions, and we can, for example, in the upper right corner, have a look at this statistics. So it's the development of the share of members of specific religions in Germany. You can see that in 1956, 45.9% of Western Germans were Roman Catholic, and 50% were Protestant. Others, well, no religion, were 4%. So roughly 96% were either Roman Catholic or Protestant. In 2015, the picture had radically changed. The share of Roman Catholics in the population, in the German population, was down to 28.9%, and the share of Protestants to 27.8%. So religion is still, and Catholic religion is still important in German society, because this is a total of 55% of Roman Catholics and Protestants. Islam is around 5 to 6% of the population share, so actually fairly small. Completely false claim that there is a Muslim takeover, that there are so many Muslims in Germany and other Western countries. But what is quite significant actually is that in 2015, 36% of Germans said that they have no religious conviction at all. They don't belong to any religion, and this is really the main cultural shift and cultural change in Western societies. So European countries and lots of societies in general have become more secular, which expresses itself as an increase of the share and number of those who have no religious conviction at all. So the major cultural trend in Europe and in Western society is not, as the far right claims, an Islamization, but it's secularization. More and more citizens doubt that God exists and that religion and faith can provide the right answers to society's problems. So being atheistic or agnostic is, just like Christianity and Islam and other belief systems, an important part of European culture. In the context of nationalism, authoritarianism, and ideology, we are today also confronted by fake news and algorithmic politics. So we could say that Donald Trump is himself a fake news factory, whom made on social media and elsewhere lots of fake news stories that he constructed and spread himself. Stories such that are false, such as the one that Obama is a Kenyan Muslim who never attended Columbia University, or he claimed once that Hillary, and repeated this claim often, that Hillary Clinton was too ill to serve as president, or that thousands and thousands of Muslims were cheering on 9/11, or that millions of people in the US voted illegally on November 8, 2016 in the US presidential election. Trump is also supported by far-right media such as Breitbart. So in the dataset that I analyzed for the Digital Demagogue book, around 2,000 tweets by Trump, there were a significant number of links to Breitbart articles. And of course, Steve Bannon was for some time the White House chief strategist of Trump. And Trump commented on Breitbart. Breitbart just covers things. I mean, it's like the New York Times. It just covers things. But what does Breitbart cover? It's a far-right ideological medium. You can see some example headlines from stories here. For example, it claims that birth control makes women unattractive and crazy. It argues, for example, in a headline, why are many diseases back decades after being wiped out in the US, arguing that migrants and refugees bring new diseases to the US, and so on. So lots of ideological claims. So-called fake news, I would more speak of false news, is not new. It's not something that just exists now in the age of social media, of Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and so on. It's really false news. I mean, is, you could say, the expression of reified consciousness, you could say, in the realm of news. Yeah, so I would more talk of false news. These are deliberately constructed false stories that do not correspond to reality, and they are really as old as tabloid media and capitalist media, yeah, because the spectacle sells, yeah, the spectacle creates attention and attracts audiences. What is new about false media is that they are user-generated false news that are compressed into short tweets, messages, memes, images, and videos. That can, such false news can in the internet circulate at a very high speed through global communication networks and social media. Let's skip this. Cambridge Analytica scandal had to do with false news, yeah, and fake news. So what happened in the Cambridge Analytica scandal is that Cambridge Analytica paid for this company paid for another company for conducting fake online personality tests in order to obtain personal data from Facebook of almost 90 million users, and this data was then used for targeting political advertising that contained false claims, false news, and such advertising was used in the US presidential election and other occasions. So Cambridge Analytica is a story that really shows the danger of the combination of far-right ideology. Far-right ideologues and demagogues were planning to use data in order to try to manipulate voters' preferences and consciousness. It's also far-right ideology combined with Facebook's digital capitalism and neoliberal politics. So Facebook believes in more data generation is good for its profits. So it benefited financially from such data leaks and selling targeted advertisements. And then there's neoliberal politics. There's no, in countries like the US, no proper data protection. Companies can do with data of users and consumers whatever they want to. Yeah, so there are very few legal restrictions. There's corporate self-regulation of data protection and privacy. So I think that's the concluding part 6 of this talk, focused on class and social struggles. There is an etymological connection of the words communication, community, and the commons. Yeah? So when we communicate, we have to do so in a community, and in communication we create linguistic and cultural commons. And the implication is that in a true communication society, the etymological origin of communication should be restored. A true communication society is a society of the commons, in the sense of communication as sharing and making something common. It means making cultural goods in common, but also creating commons in society at large, not just cultural commons, but also social commons, economic commons, political commons, through communication as a social process. So commoning is the key idea of a democratic humanist organization of society. Communication society is a society that humans control in common. This should also be the case for the means of communication. Yeah? Communications are in such a society commons-based, so they are communication system whose, as Marx wrote, primary freedom lies in not being a trade. I think today, in the realm of communication culture and technology and also digital technologies, we find a contradiction between the commodification of communication culture and tech on the one hand, and their commodification on the other hand. So on the one hand, there are strong tendencies to commodify these goods. On the other hand, there is also the tendency of socializing them, of making them more common. So, for example, non-profit-based open access publishing is such an example. The University of Westminster Press is an example. It's a university press. I was involved in founding it, and the book Communication and Capitalism, a Critical Theory is published as a digital commons, so you can download it without payment, but you can also buy it as an affordable paperback, which supports also the university press and its employees. It's not making a profit from it. Or the journal CCC that I edit as a Communication, Capitalism and Critique is also an example of a digital commons, and it publishes articles based on a Creative Commons license and on a non-profit basis. So society of the commons is a society that realizes the creation of economic commons, political commons, and cultural commons. The economic commons are self-managed companies that are controlled collectively by the workers, and the economic commons also have to do with a society and economy that creates wealth and self-fulfillment for all, where it's a post-scarcity society. The level of productivity is very high, so that necessary labor time can be reduced. People don't have to work 40 hours a week. The necessary labor time is much lower. They can act as well-rounded individuals who are not coerced by the labor market, but can freely engage in work activities and creativity. There are the political commons, so there's participatory democracy, and there are cultural commons, which means voice and recognition of all. Raymond Williams, in his cultural materialist theory, envisioned a cultural and communicative democracy. So he spoke of democratic communications as part of a democratic public sphere, where local community media, cultural cooperatives, and public service media work together. So he imagines, as he writes, new kinds of communal, cooperative, and collective institutions. In the digital age, we also need as alternative to the digital corporate giants, the strengthening of local community and alternative media, the strengthening of cultural and digital cooperatives, also of platform cooperatives, and of public service media, of traditional public service media on the one hand, and what I term a public service internet on the other hand. But in contemporary society, we are facing these contradictions that I already spoke about: economic antagonisms, political antagonisms, cultural antagonisms. The question is how they can be sublated. I think this can only be done by praxis. Praxis is a social practice that aims at establishing a socialist and humanist society. So it's the practical struggle for the establishment of a society of the commons, where common goods are strengthened and also public goods are strengthened, and commodification as a tendency is driven back. Social struggles also need their own culture, which means they need the creation and communications of stories that focus on how exploitation and domination damage human beings, how alienation works in everyday life, but also there should be stories about how resistance can be self-organized. So the communication of injustice and resistance is an important aspect of the self-organization of protest. So what is praxis all about? For Marx, praxis refers to political practices whose goal is a human-centered society. Praxis includes social struggles that aim at overcoming exploitation and domination. And Gramsci was a philosopher of praxis, stressed that praxis wants to establish an absolute humanism. So you could say it's the struggle for humanism. And such social struggles for humanism also require a communicative dimension. So it's a struggle is also a way of communicating protest. So praxis communication is always a communicative practice, but it's only a subset of communicative practices that is praxis and praxis communication. So praxis does not mean that that communication is automatically good. That's by far not the case. But praxis means a questioning of domination. So it's practical critical theory, you could say, and practical critical inquiry in the form of social struggles. Communication is a practice through which humans create and reproduce social relations. That's what I stressed in this talk, and also that's stressed in the book. And activists, of course, engage in public communication, in political communication. They use technologies such as the internet for it. And if they are left-wing or progressive activists, then they struggle for challenging exploitation and domination. I created a model of praxis communication in social struggles. There are different factors here that trigger or amplify or dampen protests. For example, the role of mainstream media, alternative media, state politics. There are societal problems that protests react to. There's civil society, social movements. There's the state and the police. There's ideology. There can be an amplification or a dampening of protest. I don't explain this model here in more detail. It's explained in more detail in the book Occupy Media, the Occupy Movement and Social Media in Crisis Capitalism, where I analyzed how various Occupy movements made use of social media and the internet and other forms of political communication in their social struggles. So I conducted a survey among activists about how they use media for trying to mobilize other people in protests and occupations, and for how they communicate protests. And what I found out is that a variety of forms of communication are used for communicating protest and for mobilizing in protests. Face-to-face communication is very important. Also social media such as Facebook are very important, but also emails to personal contacts, phoning people, sending SMS, email lists, and so on. Multiple media for mobilization-oriented communication. They use classical interpersonal communication, they use email, they use mobile phones, they use face-to-face and private communication, they use social media, and so on. It's private and public forms of communication. It's online and offline. They post announcements on social media. They do not much use alternative social media, but it's much more common that they use Twitter, Facebook, and so on. The correlation analysis showed that a high level of protest activity tends to result in a higher level of media use in protest mobilization and in protest in general. So a higher level of engagement in protests means you have a larger social network among activists, which positively influences the usage of media and social media for political mobilization. In generally, I'm interested also, and that's also covered in the final chapter of the book that is focused on class struggle. I'm interested in alternative media and what are alternative media. For me, alternative media are critical media. They are ideal type, and they are non-capitalist media. They are non-commercial media. So there are ideal type features of alternative media. The ideal type alternative media are non-commercial, they are non-profit, they create and diffuse critical content. They need audiences. Ideally, the audiences are critical consumers who engage critically with the content and use it for thinking and acting critically. If it's digital media, then also critical prosumption is enabled, where critical consumers of information become critical producers of information. However, unfortunately, the history of alternative media is also a history of precarity, of precarious labor, of a lack of funding and resources, and of a lack of visibility, because many alternative media don't sell commodities. They don't want to make a profit, so they have problems getting visibility. So maybe we cannot always work with the full ideal of alternative media, which is why I think that critical content and production and spread diffusion of critical content is really the core feature of alternative media. We are today confronted with neoliberal individualization of labor, with the digitization of labor, the blurring of the boundaries between labor time and leisure time, so that a social factory has emerged, where the boundaries between the factory and the office on the one hand, and society and everyday life on the other hand, have become blurred. These phenomena have created challenges for unionization, for the way trade unions work, for how trade unions and social movements organize social struggles. It has created challenges for how working class protests and strikes are organized. I mean, strikes, working class protests, and trade unions are today as important as ever. They are very important today because the class divisions are very deep. However, union density, the share of the workforce in unions, has in the past decades in many countries really declined. So trade unions are in a crisis. But given the globalization, digitization, and informatization of labor, also the working class has changed. We see the emergence of prosumption, of consumers of information becoming producers, which means also the way a strike is organized needs to change. We need new strike methods. A strike of knowledge workers or of academic workers needs to look, for example, different than a strike by transport workers or manufacturing workers. Strike is always the mass refusal of labor, but it needs a global level and it needs a digital level in order to improve the conditions of what Negri terms the social and societal worker. And an example was the Occupy Silicon Valley strike in 2018. It was organized by Adbusters, this magazine that is engaged in culture jamming and in creating subvertisement. It turns the logic of advertising against advertising in a kind of Brechtian manner. Brecht talked about Verfremdung, which means you alienate, alienation. You doubly negate, a negation of the negation of alienation, so that you turn alienation into its extreme, and thereby you create a critique, and that's what Adbusters is doing based on advertisements. It criticizes advertising, consumer culture, and capitalist logic and instrumental reason based on the very logic of advertising itself. And this was a campaign, an occupation of Silicon Valley. One day attempted shutdown of big tech, and of course Adbusters was also very influential in creating the foundation or formation of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So how did Occupy Silicon Valley work? In my interpretation of it is it was an attempted strike against the digital giants such as Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on. So the idea was to shut down big tech for a day, so that we make the internet ours again. So if we are workers when using the internet, then the question is, what is a digital strike? How can the digital working class organize itself? And Adbusters, this campaign wrote that big tech competes for one thing: our attention. They exploit our basic human instincts in the pursuit of unprecedented financial and cultural control. And this means if being online on platforms such as Google, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter and so on creates value and profit for digital corporations that then also don't pay taxes, then if we stop using them and collectively, then and organize campaigns around it, then this is a kind of organization of a strike and of the refusal of digital labor by the digital working class. So how the Occupy Silicon Valley campaign did this is by organizing a Google No Search Day, no search on Google, by boycotting Amazon or by tricking Amazon. Users were filling expensive goods into their Amazon shopping carts with giant orders, but abandoned them before checkout, which means that it also deceived the algorithms and made the algorithms work in an improper way. Yeah, so I think that's one small example, Occupy Silicon Valley, of how strikes could look like today. I mean, I'm not saying that traditional strikes methods are ineffective. I just think that any kind of strike, any kind of trade union activity must make use also of the internet. And also the question is how we organize non-traditional workers in the digital and cultural sector that are an important part of the working class today. And of course certain unions, non-traditional unions such as the Independent Workers Union are trying to organize freelance workers, precarious workers, platform workers, and so on. So there are already steps into the right directions. What is communicative and digital socialism? I mean, it must be part, it's a politics that must be part of a larger socialist politics, but it's based on dialectical insights into the interaction of technology and society. It's a form of radical reformism, so it struggles for demands or makes demands such as introducing a progressive basic income that is funded out of capital taxation, or taxing digital and other corporations, for radically reducing the weekly working hours in order to adequately reflect the progress made in the economy by the increase of productivity and so on. Yeah? It's important that communication workers, digital workers unionize, that they show international solidarity, that they unite across national boundaries. It's important to struggle for the collective control of the means of communication as means of production, for example, by setting up cooperative, self-managed communication and digital companies, so-called, for example, cultural cooperatives, but also platform cooperatives. It's important to argue for the breakup of corporate communication monopolies. Privacy friendliness and socialist privacy is an important principle, because the large digital corporations and corporations in capitalist corporations in general tend to treat user data and consumer data in a very privacy hostile manner. They violate users and consumers' privacy. We need public service media that are strengthened. Public service media are important for strengthening the democratic public sphere. We need a digital and internet public service media, a public service internet, and also public service internet platforms. More generally speaking, we need to strengthen the democratic and critical public sphere and its media. Part of this is also political and protest communication for progressive purposes. And finally, self-managed democratic governance of the media, yeah, so that workers and audiences play an important role in the governance and in the organization of the media that they consume. So I think the idea of public service internet is quite important, and is an aspect of the struggle against the power of digital capitalism. So public service media are now more limited to broadcasting. Think of the BBC or the public service broadcaster in other countries. They are hardly active online. They cannot establish alternatives to something like YouTube. So what I envision is, for example, a public service YouTube that is a part of the public sphere, that focus, where videos that are created, they're focusing on topics that are important for democracy. So public service media have a public service remit. One of them is strengthening, providing educational materials, but also strengthening democracy is one of them. This can be done in a new way if user-generated videos and audio can be created on a public service YouTube platform that could be organized by the BBC and then a global network of other public service broadcasters. User-generated videos, videos generated by users could accompany traditional radio and television broadcasts. There could be a documentary broadcast, for example, and then users could be asked to answer a certain question or to input certain content that they create, and at another point of time, the best user-generated content could be broadcast on television that relates to the same topic. Discriminatory content should not be allowed. It should be filtered, like right-wing content, or racism, and so on. The upload of videos on a certain topic should be possible at particular points of time. Collective production of videos should be encouraged on such a platform, because nowadays there's more an individualistic production of user-generated content. We have our individual social media profiles where we accumulate attention, visibility, or at least try to do so. But there should be social production of content. School classes, groups of pupils, students should be encouraged to together create content. Same could be done in council houses, in adult learning groups, in union, in religious and philosophical groups, in churches, civil society organizations, and so on. Digital creativity could be fostered. So digital creativity and fostering digital creativity could be part of the educational and democratic remit of public service media in the internet age. There's vast amounts of archived material, that audio and video material that public service broadcasters have in their archives. It could all be digitized and put on such a platform with a Creative Commons non-commercial license, so that users could remix and reuse it and create their own documentaries, videos, music, and so on based on it, and combine it with their own original content. A selection of user-generated content could be broadcast on particular times on radio and television. Public service media that establishes public service internet platforms should collaborate and work together in doing this. So together they are stronger and can better challenge the power of something like YouTube, that is commercial and does not have a public service remit. Nowadays, there's limited availability of online content on public service media's platforms, such as on the iPlayer. This is not really in line with the internet, so there should be unlimited availability of content produced by public service media, and that is distributed and made available online. And such content that is created on the public service internet platform should not be used for commercial and for profit purposes, but users should be allowed to reuse it for non-profit purposes. So I'm interested really in the idea of strengthening the public sphere, of developing an internet public sphere, a digital public sphere. And for me, this is an aspect. Why is this an aspect of social struggle? Well, it's an aspect of social struggle because the digital economy and the public sphere is dominated by large corporations, Facebook, Google, and others that have a commercial imperative. And social struggle means establishing alternative. It means ending the exploitation of digital and cultural workers in its own variety, and establishing alternatives. So radical reformism, must engage in creating alternative projects. And I think the Nowadays we face problems such as fake news, post-truth culture, and so on. There are filter bubbles and so on. I think an important project for strengthening the democratic public sphere was the so-called Club 2, Club 2, created by the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. It was an televised debate program broadcast on ORF, Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, from 1976 until 1995. There was also a UK version on it called After Dark, that was broadcast on Channel 4 and on BBC 4. The principle is that it's a television debate, that is a live studio debate. It's uncensored. There are controversial topics. There's a living room affair. There's no atmosphere. There's no studio audience. There are 4 to 8 diverse guests. There's one moderator. I think this is and the revolutionary, the most important principle is that it's open-ended. So the debate had unlimited airtime, so there was enough time for people to engage in discussion. Nowadays it's fast media. There's hardly any time and space for exploring the complexity of an argument. But society is complex, so when there are, for example, election debates on television, there's one question and then each candidate has 30 seconds or 1 minute to answer, but political answers should be complex because the political problems in society is complex. So when people disagree, and in order to find agreement, in order to outline their positions, there needs to be more time. So Club 2 was such a platform that provided space and time for debate, also for disagreement. It was a prototype of a slow medium. I think Club 2 and After Dark, that was really the democratic public sphere. The format disappeared with the rise of reality television, but I think it could be renewed in the age of digital media and the internet and user-generated content and social media in the format of what I term Club 2.0, Club 2.0. So how this would work is with the same principles. There is a televised controversial debate on a certain topic. It's open-ended. That's really crucial. So the guests can discuss as long as they want to. But then there's also a video platform where this is broadcast over the internet. The viewers can tune in via television, but also via the online platform, and one can make here use of the interactive possibilities of digital media and the internet and social media and user-generated content platforms. So there can be discussion inputs in textual chat form or in form of videos that can be uploaded to the platform. The users should register, maybe with their license fee number. There can be a number of discussion inputs can be made throughout the whole debate, but maybe it should be limited because it's the number of discussion inputs, because if there's a massive flow of data, then nobody can follow the discussion. One could also think of limiting the number of registered users that can really discuss and upload videos as debate inputs on the platform. They could be selected by chance, for example, 1,000 users or 100 users selected by chance who are active on one evening. That's just a suggestion. And then there's also the possibility that users can discuss via videos that they upload. They can discuss in text-based form or in audio form. Then there's the potential that users upload a discussion input, and that certain discussion inputs are directly feeding into the television debate. So it could be in a 2-3 hour long debate that there are maybe 2 to 3 video excerpts that are shown. They are selected either by a team or by a curator or by chance. They are broadcast and then they inform the debate. So the users would be asked to make inputs to the studio debate that further foster the debate. And that's an example of how public service internet platform and live TV broadcasts could be combined. I think it would decelerate a discussion. It would be important to foster also the social production of content, just like as in the example of the public service YouTube. And Club 2.0, Club 2.0, it's an idea, yeah, but it could develop into an actual format if this is taken up by public service broadcasters, and if they are enabled to do so. Club 2.0 is a manifestation of the democratic digital public sphere. It combines elements of deliberative and participatory democracy. So I think the democratic public sphere can be strengthened. It should be strengthened. It's a question about how to advance humanism today. And this book, Critical Communication and Capitalism, a Critical Theory, that was published by University of Westminster Press in English and by UTB and UVK in German, is Kommunikation und Kapitalismus, eine kritische Theorie. It tries to provide foundations of how we can analyze communication in society in a critical manner in general, and how we can think about alternatives to capitalist communications and to the colonization of the public sphere by authoritarianism, by digital corporations, transnational corporations that undermine the democratic potentials of the public sphere. So what I have in mind is the strengthening of the democratic public sphere. And I want to end with two quotes by two humanists, Erich Fromm and Emil Fuchs. And thank you for listening to this talk. Check out also the book, the English version, Communication and Capitalism, a Critical Theory, published by University of Westminster Press, the German version for those who speak German, published by UVK and UTB. So what is the perspective really, for the broader perspective for society? How can we create a humanist and democratic society? Erich Fromm argues, and also Emil Fuchs, that we need to struggle for establishing love as a social principle in society. Erich Fromm writes, if the human being is to be able to love, the human being must be put in his supreme place. The economic machine must serve him or her, rather than he or her serving it, the economic machine. A human being must be enabled to share experience, to share work, rather than at best share in profits. Society must be organized in such a way that human beings' social loving nature is not separated from social existence, but becomes one with it. Love means to speak of the ultimate and real need in every human being. And Emil Fuchs adds, the call to love is the most serious call for praxis. Thank you for your attention.